gentlemen, children of all ages, welcome to this Fuds on Film podcast, and today we are going to be talking about David Lynch, the American author of much renowned. I am Scott Morris, and I'm joined today by Craig Eastman. How are you doing?
You'd better believe you are. I'm great. How are you?
I'm similarly great.
Oh my days.
We're both great.
Oh, isn't it great?
It's great. And we're going to talk about a great man. A great man. A colossus of modern cinema, David Lynch.
Yes, a colossus of insanity,
yes.
by all accounts.
Yes, the most distinctive individual director I think there is certainly working at the minute. He is, in almost every sense of the word, inscrutable. You cannot pin this man down on anything.
And he will not be facsimiled. I've yet to see.
Not.
I've yet to see someone take on his style and succeed.
Yeah. So just a little bit of history in case you do not know the man. He born in 1946. He started off his career looking more at the visual arts. He was going to be a painter for some time before dropping out, changing to film school after an abortive attempt at going across Europe. He has then, after some smaller films, did his debut, his debut feature film, Eraserhead, brought him to international prominence, and he's gone on with a slew of films after this. Not the most prolific director you'll ever see, but certainly he's produced some of the most distinctive works in American cinema over the past 3, 4, 5 decades.
Pushing on for 4 decades now, yeah. 1978, Eraserhead, right?
Yeah. So we're going to talk about what makes this film so special. We're probably just going to take this as it comes. We'll just run through his career, more or less chronologically, which will no doubt throw up a number of things. I mean, especially, we'll just dive in straight with the first film, his first feature film, Eraserhead, which already has shown many of the hallmarks of the Lynch experience, if you like.
And how. Yeah. So shall I take it?
Go.
Yeah, take it, boy. Eraserhead, in which Jack Nance plays Henry Spencer, an employee of a local printer's who lives his solitary life amongst an oppressive industrialist hellscape shot in muted black and white. And you will know immediately by that sentence whether or not this film is going to appeal to you. One day, Henry answers the door of his apartment to Mary X, an ex-girlfriend, who invites Henry to dinner at her parents' house. Once there, Henry is party to, amongst other things, a bizarre dinner of oozing baby chickens, sudden amorous advances of Mary's mother, and the revelation that Mary has, in the interim betwixt the conclusion of her relationship with Henry, given premature birth to his mutant child. If the first sentence didn't put you off, I'm wondering if you're still with us at the conclusion of the second. Basically, what follows is an intensely unsettling and unhinged procession of events that begins with the strain placed on the now newlywed Jack and Mary's relationship by the incessantly unsettled infant, progressing through occasional glimpses of the theatre stage, apparently hidden behind Henry's radiator. Scenes of an astral body tumbling through the void and interacting with fetus-like organisms. Sparse conversations in the hallway betwixt Henry and his sultry neighbour, and occasional sojourns into the decaying cityscape through which Henry ambles, often Chaplin-like, I felt, to the constant strains of a noise-driven ambience that unsettles and infuriates in equal measure. If all of that sounds indecipherable to you, then that's because Lynch's debut feature is a maniac's manifesto that begins under a layer of abstraction and spirals increasingly into unfathomable insanity with each progressive frame. Unlike Lynch's later movies, where he breaks his audience in more subtly, Eraserhead kind of asks you within 30 seconds, are you on board with this?
Yeah.
And while that's a question posed by most of Lynch's movies, I also feel like most of them wait at least 60 seconds before setting out that stall. It's long revered as the quintessential midnight movie, which is where it sort of garnered popularity. Lynch spent something like 6 years making this film.
At least 5, yeah.
Yeah, at least 5. During which process his director of cinematography died. Whether or not that's related directly to the film, I'm not sure. In the world of Lynch, nothing is impossible. And it sort of garnered this massive, massive cult status through midnight movie showings before it became, or rather it asserted itself as a classic of modern cinema. You will know within 5 minutes whether you're going to need a second pass at this. And I most certainly do. Certainly before I feel even remotely qualified in passing judgment. I feel like I came to Eraserhead with a huge burden of expectation. It's one of those touchstone films that really kind of defines the modern lexicon of cinema, and based on my enjoyment of a great deal of Lynch's other works to varying degrees, I assumed that I was going to come to Eraserhead and immediately click with it.
Yeah.
And it is by far his most outlandish movie. I think, if anything, it suffers from "this is my first film and I'm going to throw every idea I've ever had at the screen" syndrome. But I didn't engage with Eraserhead. I'm going to be honest. I don't feel like I enjoyed it on this first viewing, and it sounds like you might be in agreement.
Yeah, it's easily the hardest of Lynch's films to watch, and given what else this man has done, that is actually saying something.
Well, yeah.
It is a film I have struggled to engage with on a number of occasions. I believe I first picked up a copy of this sometime during my student career, having seen some of his rather more accessible stuff at that point. And given the reputation like yourself, I was expecting it to be something really quite special, but I found quite a lot of it to be actually a bit dull. I found it very difficult to engage with anything at all. It's one of the few times I've just admitted defeat and stopped watching it. Indeed, until a few days ago, I hadn't watched it all the way through to the end. Twice at least, then I clearly remember I've started watching this with all good intentions and just given up after 40 minutes or so. This last time was I felt compelled to watch it all the way through to the end, but I don't really think it's either enlightened me a great deal or has really enhanced my enjoyment of it. There's a very common position that you could take about David Lynch, and that is that his films are nonsense. Right? There is.
It's hard to argue against.
Yes, I mean, right. You can. It's of course aided by this ethos because he is so impenetrable. He will not give any information away. He doesn't even talk. Yeah. He doesn't like talking about his films. I mean,
exactly. Not least of all, right? Because when approached about it himself, more often than not, he just kind of shrugs his shoulders and goes, "Eh."
Yes, and he's one of these characters. I mean, he doesn't like talking about pretty much anything. I believe he's some early. I was reading something about his earlier years. He almost didn't talk for the first 20 years of his life. He's very minimalist in what he tries to say, and that obviously comes across in all the dialogue and throughout his works. But it's especially prevalent here. A great many elements in his films are just simply never explained. They're inexplicable in the very real sense of just there is no way this would happen. This could happen. There's no logical explanation for any of it, and it's not films that are based on logic. But you can't use that as a tool.
No, of course, we're going to spend a lot of this podcast talking about dream logic.
Yes,
which is the thing that he sort of evokes the most, but this isn't so much of a dream as a nightmare.
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly pictured more as some sort of, well, I mean, it's psychological horror, I guess, more than anything else, because there's very few things that are outright scary, apart from just this unsettling, unnerving tone that's created in quite effectively in several places. But it's not enough to really hang the rest of the film on it. It is too outre for the rest of it. There's so much things going on that just kind of bring you out of it, that work against the kind of oppressive nature that it's trying to build up in places where I think it might be more effective. There's too many silly bits. I don't know why there's a theatre between the radiator and there, and I don't know why there's a woman that looks a bit like a hamster singing there. There's just things that are thrown in that have no meaning and no symbolism or anything like that. And for that, it's a bit weak.
And I know that the sort of the accepted reading of this is that it's about Lynch's fear of becoming a father, which is kind of poo-pooed by the fact that he was a father before he started producing this. So perhaps more a reflex to having become a father and a fear of fatherhood. And I can kind of get where people are coming with that. But with anything that David Lynch does, like say, he refuses to engage in discourse around any of his films, and on any number of occasions has basically said it's whatever you want it to be. And if he himself refuses to define his movies as anything, it's very, very difficult to accept any one particular notion of what it's supposed to be.
Yeah,
you're really taking everything on faith. I mean, the opening of this movie, I made notes as I was watching this, right? And I would also give you the caveat that when I say I didn't really engage with this movie, I was watching it on an iPad, which is it's never going to be the most ideal situation to watch a movie in.
Yeah, and I'm sure one that Lynch has specifically called out against doing on many occasions.
Yes, exactly. So I will pay this film the courtesy of going back and watching it on a bigger screen. But literally, like 6 minutes of nothing for an opening. It could be a meteor spinning through space. It could be David Lynch's lunch. Either way, I and probably he himself would implore you not to think too much about it. It's like a lot of his other cinema, and actually more, I feel like he kind of does a bit of a leapfrog from this, and he comes back around. He sort of goes to a slightly tamer material for a lot of his studio stuff, and then sort of comes back to this more pervasive sort of dream environment in more recent films. But you will always find that a David Lynch film seems to be going for atmosphere, or certainly in most cases anyway, where he hasn't adapted his work from other material. There's this atmosphere that I feel he's trying to aim for in a lot of his films, and the difference with Eraserhead is that it seems to want to attack you with that atmosphere rather than envelop you in it. It's like he wants it to be this thing. There's this pervasive background audio all through the film that's this sort of industrial mishmash of noise, and like sometimes it resolves itself visually. Like there's a sound that sounds like someone tuning in a radio to like a just off station that's broadcasting solely screeching bats, and that turns out to be a litter of pups suckling at their mother's teat, right? And then other times it doesn't, such as like throughout the early part of the film where he's in, I want to say in his own apartment, and or possibly just his girlfriend's apartment or his ex-girlfriend's parents' house. There's this background noise which sounds, I've made a note here, it sounds akin to a woman being tortured at the far end of a mile-long copper pipe. It's this really, he really wants to unsettle you with this, and he's throwing this stuff at you and and I almost feel like he overbuilds the atmosphere in this one, and I almost like completely disengaged from it because it was too dense and it was too oppressive.
Yeah, it's a hard ask. In all the ones that of sort of a similar ilk that I enjoy, you're eased far more gently into it, and it has a time to kind of creep up around you, and it's at its best when it sneaks up on you and you don't really, you're not aware of what's going to, the thing that's about to unfold until it's already too late and you're already sucked into it. Whereas this is just slamming you headfirst into a brick wall from the first frame, and it's a hard ask. It's now, I've got to say, I don't like Eraserhead. I don't think it's anything like his best work. However, as a historical document and as a manifesto of what he's going to do, it's certainly important. You can see an awful lot of things in here that he'll return to time and time again. Arguably much better. However, it's certainly, you can't argue the fact that he's setting out his stall early on in his career and showing you exactly what he intends to do when he gets autonomy to do it.
And don't get me wrong, there are bits of this that works, but where I find it tends to work the best are in the slightly more subtle interactions, like if you put aside all the sort of perverse imagery that permeates this, the couple of exchanges that he has with his neighbour across the hall, who's this amazing, like stunning woman it's so difficult to define, but his interaction with her is really subtle, and there's this almost menacing tone to the way in which she's. The best way I can describe it is like a menacing sexuality. Yeah. To the way that she engages with him, and very like this woman is only ever lit by apparently a single candle. Yeah. Like if you're, I was trying to think of how to describe it earlier, and the only way I can think is if you're a fan of film photography and you know anything about Ansel Adams' zone system, this woman is exposed constantly at zone 2. If you understand that, there you go. You'll know exactly what I'm talking about. This really strange, and there's a very, when he's being subtly unnerving like that in Henry's interaction with his neighbour, I find it's more successful than when he's throwing the oblique imagery at the screen. There's obviously, I mean, the mutant child is obviously its own thing, and it's like indecipherable.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the sort of constantly repeated imagery of the sort of the theme of the fetus, the as you mentioned, like on the stage, there's a performance which is repeated to varying degrees by a young woman with bizarrely puffed out cheeks, who I almost want to say that I almost took away from it that she was supposed to be his daughter or like his child, were it to develop to adulthood or something like that. That is a wild guess on my part, but the stuff like that, like the bizarreness of there being a theatre stage behind his radiator and stuff, it's just far too oblique.
It's partly what I find infuriating in the Lynch films that I don't like, is that it's so open-ended to interpretation that, you know, and by design, this could mean anything, but because it could mean anything, it actually means nothing. Yeah. And I get a lot of it is, it's like an entire film full of symbols but not symbolic of anything, just symbolic in general. And it doesn't really wind up saying anything at the end of the day. It's a great thing to analyse. I mean, it's almost like it's bait for, film criticism classes, because you can go to town on almost any Lynch film with any interpretation you like, and to be fair, it's probably as valid as anyone else's.
Down for it.
Yes. But it doesn't help. In a lot of ways, I am quite a traditional film goer. I like stories. I like stories to have beginnings, middles, and ends that more or less tie up. And for an awful lot of things in David Lynch's work, you're not going to get that. You're going to get something that can make more sense on emotional levels rather than narrative, and the best of his films achieve that, and when it does manage to have all that tied together, it works fantastically well and better than almost any other bit of cinema you'll see. But when it whiffs, it becomes a big steaming pile of nonsense, and it's very easy at some point for your brain just to go, nope, not playing with this anymore, and just watching it for the objective nonsense that it is. I don't mean that particularly pejoratively, but it doesn't make sense. And Eraserhead's kind of the poster child for me for that. It doesn't make sense.
I'm reassured, but I kind of knew that. I mean, we haven't discussed this previously to now, and I'm reassured, but I kind of knew that you were going to feel the same way about it. For the handful of films that we've disagreed on over the years, I knew you were going to agree with me on Eraserhead. It's very much its own thing, and more power to him for setting out his manifesto so clearly in the first place. But yeah, it feels kind of like oversaturated thematically, and it's abstraction upon abstraction, and it's one of those things, it's almost impossible to even begin unpicking it. But as you say, it's very much as an object of interest in terms of plotting out this guy's career. It is an essential piece of his canon, and you can't really talk about Lynch without talking about Eraserhead, and well, we've done that now. There you go.
That would move you on to 1980's Elephant Man, which is a entirely different kettle of fish. Another criticism, perhaps, that's leveled at Lynch is that the man can't tell a straight story or anything like that, which, of course, was the lead up to the film that we'll talk about later on, Straight Story. However, I think when you start leveling things like that at Lynch, you kind of have to completely disregard Elephant Man, which is not only a brilliant film, I really like Elephant Man, but it is, in almost every term, entirely conventional. I mean, unless you're of the opinion that it's perhaps a bit deliberately quirky shooting a film in 1980 in black and white, but that is really the only element of the film that I would say that is even slightly non-standard, if you like. It's a tale of a man with a severe physical disfigurement, John Merrick, who is being shown as in Victorian times as a circus freak. He is happened across by Anthony Hopkins' doctor, who of course finds him a fascinating specimen, and extracts him from this life, takes him to hospital, and kind of makes a study on him, and to a large extent winds up kind of exhibiting him for his own benefits, as he's kind of becomes a bit of a sensation in London society at the time. But of course, it's a far more pleasant life, and he has a far better thing for, certainly in terms of for John Merrick's physical well-being and mental well-being, as he kind of takes him from, well, as he says, from being an animal to being a human being, as the kind of his arc goes in this film. It is entirely conventionally told, and an incredibly good film. It's an incredibly enjoyable film. It's a nice, a sort of understandable message. It is has so many great performances in it. As a brilliant performance from John Hurt, probably his best. Even underneath all that prosthetics, he does incredibly well in this. And Anthony Hopkins is probably more likable in this than he is in nearly any other film. So many great performances in there, and even there's some. You'll start to see some people who will come through many films in the future, like Freddie Jones. It's even got an enjoyable turn from Boone, Michael Elphick, of all people. Yes, so
hi ho, Silva.
Indeed. Yeah, I think it's a really great film. It's, if you're going to argue with anything, then if you're talking about it in the terms of Lynch's career arc, then it's not like too many other things that he's done. It's far more conventional, but that doesn't make it any less of a good film. So I heartily enjoyed it.
Am I correct in saying, no, I haven't watched Elephant Man yet, to my eternal shame, because when we were kind of looking through the back catalogue, I prioritised the more overtly Lynchian films over stuff like Elephant Man and Straight Story, because I knew I wouldn't have time to watch them all. But having read a little bit about the history of Elephant Man, is this the movie that Stanley Kubrick asked him to direct? Am I correct in saying Kubrick asked him to do this? He was approached by George Lucas to direct one of the Star Wars movies, and he was also approached by Stanley Kubrick, I believe, to direct this. And surprisingly, he said no to George Lucas. I want to say that's correct trivia, but your silence suggests that you were unaware of this. So I'm not gonna say I can back it up with paperwork.
Yeah, not something that's not something I'm aware of. But regardless of that, I think it is a good film. There is, as you say, not a great deal of Lynchian aspects to it, if you're going to go down, if you're going to call it that. That shouldn't dissuade from the fact that, here's a guy that can do a very competently produced adaptation of a play, I believe this was. But it's just very well paced. It's very well shot throughout. It looks really great. Black and white is, I don't know, I guess something of a stylistic choice, but it works incredibly well for this film. It lends a nice air to it. There's no departures in the dream logic or anything like that. It's just a very sensible film, one more or less historically accurate, and not exactly, but close enough for government work. And it works incredibly well. It's something that's really good to watch. Just if you are used to him just basically being the kind of out there Mulholland Drive-isms of his work, then this is just 180 degrees removed from that. It's a very conventionally but incredibly well told story. It shows that he's not just someone who is producing the first nonsense that comes into his head. If he needed to, he could competently tell a story straightly and very, very well, very as good as any other director could possibly have done. So it's something to watch if you ever think that this guy is perhaps just a charlatan who's getting away with a lot of things that he perhaps shouldn't be. This is a good reminder that no, he's a really good director who can, on a conventional field with anyone else, can do just as well as any other director. And it's important on that basis, and it's also important just for being a very good film, which rightfully won him clutches of awards, which is very good to see for someone, especially given how early he was in his career. Has got to be a great boost for him too.
Yes, indeed. And then I suppose normally at this point we would probably talk about Dune, right? But do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because we're going to do a separate podcast commentary, aren't we?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to doing the commentaries. One of the other things I was thinking about with when we were talking about doing a David Lynch film, the David Lynch podcast, is that he's a guy who's done probably the widest range of films for any one director that I can think of. He's done really bad films that I hate, or I consider bad films. He's done films that I would consider good that I don't like. He's done films that are bad that I do like. And he's done a lot of films that I just don't care about in the slightest.
He's in all four quadrants.
Yeah, he's all over the shop. Often for exactly the same reasons. He's such a hard guy to pin down. But Dune is the bad film that I nonetheless like. But it is important to point out that it is a bad film. Also worth mentioning in passing, if you've not seen the excellent documentary Jodorowsky's Dune about Alejandro Jodorowsky, I think it's, forget his first name actually, but
Alejandro.
Yes, his attempts to bring Dune to life before it was passed on to Lynch is well worth watching, which cheated us from the goal of Space Prince Andy Warhol. Instead, we got Lynch's vision, which isn't any good at all. It largely suffers from... It's not too desperately far away from the book, but it doesn't explain an awful lot of the things that happen in the book. So if you've read the books, you probably have a decent idea of what's going on, but if you've not, you will have no clue what's going on in this. But he's gone on record as saying it's a film that kind of got away from him when the studios started taking too much involvement in what gets shown on the screen, and it just didn't really work. It was a colossal failure. It was one of the most expensive films to make, and it flopped quite badly. Critically, did equally poorly. It has, it's for a number of reasons that it's a mess of a film, and it obviously was a bit of a real hit to his career as becoming something bankable. Because after The Elephant Man did quite well, this was seen as a real failure, a real falling flat in his face when he was given such a big budget to do something that was, essentially kind of cashing on the Star Wars craze that was going on at the time. We'll go into more depth of that at the time, but I think the main thing to take from Dune is he was given an opportunity to spend an awful lot of money making something, and I still think it has some merit, but yeah, it did not fare well critically or commercially. And I'm looking forward to podcasting that commentary immensely. Yeah. I've never watched Dune. I'm aware of the sort of touchstone moments that have permeated popular culture, such as Sting floating about in a giant nappy. Yes. But having only read about a third, I think I got about a third of the way through Frank Herbert's novel before I packed it in. I never went back to it. Not for any reason other than the fact it was just I found it quite tough going, not that I wasn't enjoying it. So I'm quite intrigued to see what Lynch did with this, because I'm aware of the fact that it's held aloft as an example of bad filmmaking, and a director going off the rails / too much studio involvement, etc. So I cut it a lot of slack because I really like the book, but I've got a bad habit of doing that. I mean, I couldn't even bring myself to properly hate the first Judge Dredd film because I love Judge Dredd so much, and even that was abysmal, but... I have kind of the same relationship with Dune. It's not by no means a good film, but nonetheless it's one that I enjoy. When you move past that, you get into a couple of years later, 86, Dennis Hopper showing up in Blue Velvet.
Indeed.
One of yours?
And to many people remains Lynch's masterpiece. One of the great cinematic explorations of the flip side to small-town America's suburban dream, where below perfectly manicured picket-fenced lawns monsters lurk, plying their ugly trade. Kyle MacLachlan is Jeffrey Beaumont, a college student who returns to quaint Lumberton to take the reins of the family hardware business when his father's collapses on one of said lawns. Jeffrey, by chance, stumbles upon a severed human ear, as you do, which he brings to the attention of local police detective John Williams, played here by George Dickerson, if I remember correctly. Unsatisfied by Williams' reluctance to share progress on the ensuing investigation, Jeffrey takes a cue from the detective's daughter Sandy, Laura Dern's first appearance in a Lynch movie, and that leads him to sultry nightclub singer Dorothy Valance, played by Isabella Rossellini, and in turn her abusive, psychopathic, maybe boyfriend Frank Booth, Dennis Hopper, as you have already mentioned. As Jeffrey's investigation turns to the unhinged Booth, he becomes dangerously sexually involved with Dorothy, kickstarting a chain of events that belie the true nature not just of Dorothy's relationship with Frank, but of her masochistic self, and propelling the young would-be sleuth on something of a brutal, accelerated coming of age. And again, there are various interpretations, various readings of Blue Velvet, but it is one of the more accessible of Lynch's films. I will grant him that. It is a coming-of-age movie. It's also a deconstruction of suburbia. And in many respects, it's also the Hardy Boys meets 9.5 Weeks. It's got a lot of vibes going on, but it's been some time since I last watched Blue Velvet, actually, and I was at the time unimpressed, as I remember. You're probably talking about my later teenage years, and I was still just sort of developing my critical faculties at that point. But I have to say that on this viewing, which was earlier today as it happens, something clicked, and I really found myself enjoying it. It's almost played straight if you subtract the sort of brief weirdness at the beginning and the very final act. It's very, very close to just a conventional film. It's more of a mystery that happens to involve massively eccentric characters than Lynch's traditional dream reality that we spoke about before. And it's much easier, I think, for a general audience to relate to, and I can understand why a lot of people find this to be the sort of the ideal bridge between the very Lynchian material of something like Eraserhead and the very sort of, I suppose, in Lynchian terms, the narrow spectrum of his straight films like Elephant Man and Straight Story. But I'm guessing you've got something to say about that.
Well, Blue Velvet is roughly, I would consider it part of a loose trilogy with Lost Highway and Mulholland Drive. And to my mind, it's probably the least successful of them. I don't dislike Blue Velvet, but I really can't get behind it. I have really got one major problem with Blue Velvet, and it's Dennis Hopper. I find his scenery chewing just to completely ruin the mood of any film. I just cannot take Dennis Hopper in this film seriously at all.
He does over-egg it a little bit here, doesn't he?
If he had toned it down a notch or two, then he would be a really menacing and creepy character that would really propel that sort of last half of the film along and really sort of crank up the tension and the dramatic nature of that. But he's not. He's a clown, and I don't take him seriously at all. And it's, if anything, most of the film, as you say, is played quite straight, which makes the moments where it isn't all the more off-putting. I'm thinking in particular, there's one scene towards the end, just after they get out of the car, where it's the one time where Dennis Hopper is actually being properly menacing without going over the top, when he's sort of just getting right up in Kyle MacLachlan's face. And it would be a tremendously really powerful scene if it weren't for the fact that some random woman was jumping up and down on a car in the background for no logical reason. And it's just moments like that that just really drop you out of this and make you kind of... It's those moments where you just realise, oh yes, I'm watching a film, aren't I?
And Dennis Hopper's goons as well, sort of the overtly Lynchian sort of sideshow characters who pop up sort of throughout, who are peppered throughout his films, are all attributable to Dennis Hopper's gang in this. So Jack Nance, from Eraserhead, who was in just about every Lynch film, I think, up until the point at which he passed away, is one of Dennis Hopper's goons. And the other guys that hang about, they're all sort of clubbed together, and they're just this sort of, they are, and Hopper's obviously the most overt example, but they are just this sort of little cloud of insanity that hovers about around the movie and intervenes at points where otherwise, it would be far more easy to take seriously. And as you say, they do serve to kind of remove you from the experience somewhat when they do pop up and start chewing the scenery, as you say.
Yeah. Perhaps notable, I think, in this instance for his... it's probably the best. It's where you start to see the importance of the music in Lynch's films as well. It's the start of his long collaboration with Angelo Badalamenti, but even just the use of things like the Blue Velvet, the Roy Orbison track, the Bobby Vinton track and the Roy Orbison and Dreams track that's there, that really are used to enhance the mood by taking something familiar and subverting it. Which is something that we'll use quite a bit as well, I think, in later films. And previous to this, not that there's not been effective use of music, but it's not been quite so twisted as he starts doing from here on out. But yeah, I just don't find it a particularly enjoyable film, and it falls between those two stools. It's there's too much silliness in there to really take it seriously as a straight film, and it's not surreal enough to start layering alternate interpretations onto it. You can make a pass at it, and you'll have some success, but I don't think it really holds a lot of scrutiny. It's by no means bad, but I think that it's nothing like as successful as a lot of people claim it to be. In my mind, it's interesting. It's certainly well worth watching, but it doesn't really do it for me. It's a bit of a shame. I'm not so much of a fan of it.
I mean, I still have a clear favourite Lynch film, and this is not it. But I was surprised at how much I enjoyed it this time round. I get the impression I probably enjoyed it more than yourself, but I do absolutely agree with the points that you make that you found detracting. Probably it's safe to say they detracted me less. Mm-hmm. But I think, Dennis Hopper is a problem in this movie, and I can't help but feel it's just that thing of, Dennis Hopper probably refusing to be directed any other way than he wanted to be.
Hopper's gonna hop. He's not known for his restraint in many films, but it doesn't work here. I don't think it works at all.
No, it doesn't. And probably if we move on then to Wild at Heart, 1990.
Yes.
Similarly, one of Lynch's most linear movies, albeit in the sense that I suppose someone like Robert Mugabe could be described as marginally less unhinged than, say, Hitler was. Ostensibly, it's a Lovers on the Run road movie, and sees Nick Cage's character Sailor and Laura Dern's Lula. Laura Dern making a welcome return. On the run from Lula's oppressive mother Marietta, played with suitably histrionic abandon, or Hopper-like abandon, shall we say, by Diane Ladd. It opens at a function where Marietta's drunken advances towards Sailor have been spurned, and a hitman abruptly paid to rub Sailor out at the end of a flick knife, which seems harsh, but not as harsh as Sailor's response, which is to cave his assailant's head in against the cold marble floor of the venue in graphic detail. Sometime later, after a stint in Choke, Sailor emerges and immediately breaks parole to go on the run to California with Lula. Not to be deprived of her daughter so easily, Marietta hires a number of characters to track and kill Sailor, not least of which are Calvin Lockhart and Grace Zabriskie's deranged sexually charged duo Reggie and Juana, both of whom are invoked at the behest of Marietta's criminal lover Marcellus Santos, played by with great gusto by J.E. Freeman, and Marietta's other lover, Johnny Farragut, a private detective played by good old Harry Dean Stanton. Always a pleasure to see Harry. Lynch works in plenty of trademark bizarre characters along the way. It must be said, none of whom have any bearing on the plot whatsoever until we arrive in the two-horse Dust Bowl town of Big Tuna, whereupon we meet Willem Dafoe's scenery-chewing alter ego, Bobby Peru, which I think might be my favourite character name from any Lynch film. Bobby leverages Sailor's lack of cash and the recent revelation that Lula is carrying their child to coerce Sailor into accompanying him on a doomed criminal venture, leading us into the movie's final act. There was a time in my misspent youth when I saw this movie late at night on BBC Two and I loved it. But now, with the benefit of 2 decades of hindsight and more roundly developed faculties, I share more in common with the sizable group of critics who booed the movie when it was awarded the Palme d'Or at Cannes that year. I tend to find myself more on their side of the fence now. In the wake of an opening that promises much, Wild at Heart quickly devolves into a somewhat repetitive, senseless shambles of valueless sexual dioramas, needless character exposition, and forced nods to oblique Lynch tropes that I kind of feel were crowbarred in order to remind the audience that this is a Lynch movie.
Yeah.
Nowhere does this jar so much as in the conclusion to Sailor and Bobby's robbery attempt and the resulting denouement, which final act feels as though Lynch has completely given up and is almost openly mocking his audience. Opinions are obviously going to vary, but I sense that in developing someone else's source material to fit his own mould, Lynch perhaps lost sight of what he was trying to achieve, and the end result serves, if I'm honest, I feel like it serves less in breaking genre conventions and more to remind us why they exist in the first instance.
Not so down on Wildest Heart as you are, but it's not a good movie on a number of levels. I've just distracted it as the best single sentence summation on IMDb that I think I've seen for any film. Is just summed up as young lovers Sailor and Lula run from the variety of weirdos that Lula's mum has hired to kill Sailor. Which is
I was looking at that earlier. Way to distill it.
Yes, I mean it is daft, and I think what saves it for me is that it's daftness. It is very clearly not taking itself seriously.
No,
I mean it's the sort of film that again, it's almost the sort of film that if you'd put a different soundtrack on this, you could probably sell it as a serious Lynchian, dream logic trope thing going on, but it's not. It's quite clearly got a sense of fun and is not taking itself remotely seriously, and that saves it from, well, certainly it saves it from me getting particularly wound up about how daft it is, and it is daft. Willem Dafoe, what are you doing?
I listen in the same way that Dennis Hopper's scenery chewing took the edge off Blue Velvet. I feel like Willem Dafoe's scenery chewing is the one thing that kind of saves Wild at Heart for me. I don't completely dislike it. I'm not as in love with it as I was when I first saw it. I just feel like revisiting it now, I'm like, oh, come on. Yeah. I feel like this was Lynch just kind of about a little bit.
I mean, it's a very different tone than he will take in almost anything that he does outside of this. Despite the content matter, which is not really something that would be expected to be seen in a comedy, this is really just a comedy, a slightly black comedy, or perhaps a grey comedy. It's not so dark, but it's a weird mishmash. It doesn't really work on a number of levels, as you say, but because it doesn't seem to be reaching for anything other than just being a distraction for a few hours, and so on that basis, it kind of gets away with it. But it's setting itself up a fairly low goal, and it probably achieves that goal, but it's not a goal worth shooting for.
And correct me if I'm wrong here, but actually, one of those trademark Nick Cage performances, which is actually quite a rubbish performance, but you kind of don't notice that it's rubbish because of the context of the movie.
Yeah. No, it is not subtle. No. But, I mean, he does have a nice jacket, which is an expression of his individuality.
and his belief in personal freedoms.
Yes. No, daft. Perhaps worth touching, because you mentioned it a little bit there, on the copious number of sex scenes that are in this film. And it's not,
which made it incredibly difficult for me to watch on my iPad sitting on a train down to London next to a stranger the other day.
Yeah, you carefully angle that one away and hope that it doesn't get the reflection in the window. Yeah,
annoyingly broad viewing angle on those iPad Airs.
Yes, so there's a lot of it, and I think not so much with this film, but Lynch does get a reputation for having sort of this eroticism in his works. This really isn't it. I mean, this is a very short step away from soft pornography for a lot of what it's doing. At least it's nothing like as grim as the sex that occurs in something like Blue Velvet. This is, by the nature of it, it's a bit less aggressive and a bit happier, and something it won't really return to until Mulholland Drive. But his use of sex is almost it's kind of hard to take. I mean, obviously it's a very important part of human nature, but the way that Lynch uses it, I've always felt feels a little bit cheap. He'll throw nudity and sex around in situations where I'm not really sure it added anything, and it doesn't really gain anything to the film.
I feel like it's almost punctuation to signal the start of the next act. Like in this, very, very, very difficult to justify. It's almost like part of the structure of the film.
Yeah, I mean, it's got a lot of his works. He seems to be like, I like seeing tits, so let's put some tits in it. And I'm sure it's nothing like as simple as that in Lynch's mind. But when you watch it on screen, that often is what comes across. Is just that it's gratuitous, and it doesn't really add anything to the film. And I feel it's just a little bit exploitative, and it's not a crutch that he needs.
No, he can make us feel uncomfortable in a number of other ways without that kind of sort of discomfort as a viewer.
Yeah, but it's not a critical juncture of Wild at Heart, which is too daft to really to have any sort of bearing on it. No, it's certainly one of his weaker films. I can't bring myself to dislike it, but it's by no means good. A soundly mediocre one. I think if you're putting these in a list of order you want to see them, you can probably skip over this one with no great disillusion. After Wild at Heart, I think he would then take us on to Twin Peaks, which, to my eternal shame, I've seen like the pilot in the first episode after that and never managed to get a conjunction of it being on streaming and me having time to watch it since then.
Very much the same for me. What I remember of it in my formative years, I haven't caught a couple of episodes. I was quite mesmerised by it because when was that? So I was probably about 11, 12 when that was doing rounds on television. I obviously was, my mind was clearly blown by that kind of thing. But yeah, I didn't ever actually get around to watching the whole series.
Yeah, that's something we will really probably have to rectify and perhaps update this as it goes by. Unfortunately, Drew's couldn't be here for this, but I know it's one of his favourite David Lynch work. So maybe we'll try and pump him for some information during the Dune commentary.
Let's waterboard him.
Yeah, but let's waterboard him for his opinions on Dune, which, well, we've proven that's not an effective way to get information. So,
but it does pass a couple of hours.
Yeah, it's fun, and it's a laugh. Of course, we'll get a chance, hopefully, to see, well, I would hopefully we'll reissue and re-show the original Twin Peaks, because he's returning to this next year it'll probably be, I would think.
I think it's slated as 2017, but they're filming. Yeah. They'll be filming next year. Yeah, they finally settled the disagreements that they'd had.
Yeah, so a mere what's that, 27 years later that'll be
something like that. Yeah.
For it to get another series. So you're returning to that font, and I hope that to have a better opinion on it by that point. Maybe we can share with you then. So that takes us over the Twin Peaks movie as well, Fire Walk With Me, this kind of prequel, which I've not watched because there didn't seem to be a lot of point watching a prequel to something I've not seen the actual
likewise
series for, which then takes you to all the way up to 1997. Wow, with Lost Highway, a tale where the narrative is very difficult to really relay without sounding like I've had a stroke.
Would you describe it as fractured?
That's one way of putting it, certainly. Very crudely fractured as well. You're introduced to Bill Pullman's Fred Madison, who's a jazz musician. He's often seen freaking out in a jazz bar with his saxophone. Or is it trumpet? I forget. Anyway, he certainly freaks out. And then his life is thrown into a bit of turmoil when some unusual occurrences start happening. He gets mailed a video of someone seems to have posted surveillance cameras in his house, and things seem to be going incredibly strange for him. Then all of a sudden he finds himself framed for killing his wife, Patricia Arquette, Renee Madison, which is something of a shock to him. So he goes to prison, and then one day he wakes up and he's a different character. All of a sudden, Bill Pullman's turned into what's the name? Well, he's turned into Balthazar Getty, Pete Dayton. And at which point he's, to the mystification of all the prison guards who release him, at which point we start a completely different arc. Before he was mysteriously vanished and then showed up in a different prison cell, he was a car mechanic. He then winds up going back to his old job, taking care of particularly he's taking care of Mr. Eddie, his appears to be a mob boss, Robert Logia's character, taking care of his car until he unfortunately falls for Mr. Eddie's doll, who played by Patricia Arquette as Alice Wakefield, another completely different character. And this sort of fatal attraction, of course, brings him into conflict with Mr. Eddie, and then after a while things get even weirder when it sort of Mobius strips itself back round to the start, and for various reasons, Bill Pullman's character reasserts itself somehow, and logic flies out of the window at that point, and you're left just kind of wondering what the hell's going on.
And all I remember of this film, bar the saxophone and the waking up as a different character, is at some point someone tripping up and impaling their head on the corner of a glass coffee table.
Yes, amazingly. In almost every sense of that word. It is a puzzling film and tough to know exactly what to make of it. Notable for a Gary Busey performance that in no way is chewing the scenery, which is unusual given what we've talked about. Another film with Henry Rollins in it. Can't get away from that. But there's something to Lost Highway that is, if nothing else, really interesting. I'm not 100% sure that it works for the same reason that you can kind of see. We'll be talking about Mulholland Drive very soon, which is what we're trying to get to, but there's a path going between Blue Velvet, Lost Highway and Mulholland Drive, and Mulholland Drive is quite clearly the perfect destination for it, and he's kind of triangulating in on that, and it's almost there with Lost Highway, but not quite. It's, again, not quite bizarre enough, consistently enough, to have you in the sort of set, to get your brain into that sort of mood where you can accept things like characters waking up and becoming a different character without it just putting a real brake on anything approaching immersion, because it's another one of these things, literally inexplicable. Right, there is no explic to be had in this.
No,
and because of that, it's very tough to take the rest of it remotely seriously. And in something like Mulholland Drive, it's a lot of it, all the same criticisms would apply, but because it's done a better job of kind of suckering you into the logic of it, then you don't have the conflicting elements of both dream logic and actual reality logic conflicting with each other in quite the same way that you do with Lost Highway. Whereas it was a very minor element in Blue Velvet, and it didn't hurt it too much. There's other problems with Blue Velvet. In this, the balance isn't quite right between that sort of dream logic and actuality. It just can't quite coexist in the same way that it can in Mulholland Drive, where when the balance tips and different things happen in Mulholland Drive, it's much easier, I find, to go with the events of Mulholland Drive than it is with Lost Highway, even though in a number of ways they're kind of similar. It's not too dissimilar from the overarching a sort of a generalisation of Mulholland Drive's plots, but it doesn't quite work so well here. It's not helped by the fact that it's not switching between two particularly interesting narratives. The narrative in Lost Highway only becomes interesting when it starts putting in the more unorthodox elements, the actual surrealism sections where it tries to link the two between these kind of mystery characters showing up with ways to apparently bend the laws of time and space. But until these are the only bits that really give it a lot of interest, the rest of it's a fairly common little tale that doesn't really go anywhere. And that's a bit of a shame. It's not, I think, his most successful element of it. It sits between Blue Velvet and Mulholland Drive quite uncomfortably. It's between two bar stools. It's not quite sitting on anything, and so it's falling on the floor. But bit of a missed opportunity. You can't really fault a lot of it. I mean, we've not really made too much of a meal of it, but I mean, I think you can make a generalisation to say that the cinematography in all of Lynch's work's fantastic. Looks really great. Soundtrack's very effective. He gets good performances out of everyone that's in his films, I think. Some surprisingly good performances. But there's just nothing at the end of the day to back up this film. It's a bit of a downer for me. I didn't enjoy it quite so much.
But we can see which direction he's heading in.
Yeah, so following on from Lost Highway, while Lynch was in discussions which would eventually lead to Mulholland Drive, which was going to be a TV show for a while before eventually becoming the film that we will see talk about a bit later on. But in the same year as that was kicking off, he also directed The Straight Story, which is, as kind of mentioned earlier, was often seen as a rebuff to people who just think he's just directing these weird, out there, somewhat surrealistic pieces. Here's a story that is entirely conventionally told and shot. Some people still call it a surreal road movie, and it clearly isn't, apart from the fact that the guy is taking a somewhat unusual mode of transport. The basics of it is you're introduced to Alvin, played by Richard Farnsworth, who is an elderly gentleman who, in a mid-eastern town that would be, I think he's in Iowa. He is in a remote part of the town, very rural, and he's informed that his brother, who he's been somewhat estranged from, hasn't seen in a good many years, has had a stroke and decides that he will go off and see him. Unfortunately, he's no longer in possession of a car. His eyesight's not good enough to pass the driving licence, so he decides that rather than do anything sensible like take a bus, he is going to make his own way over there by getting on a ride-on lawnmower and a trailer full of the essentials for the 3-week, I believe it wound up being, journey across the state lines to see his brother as he embarks on this little road trip, leaving behind his daughter, who's perhaps a little bit but mentally challenged roles played by City Spacek. And along the way, he got a number of interactions with people, either hitchhikers or people along the way who help him get through various situations. And really, it's an immensely charming film, in no small part because of Richard Farnsworth's performance, which is just endearing. He's the sort of slightly cantankerous old person that I think we'd all love to be able to think we'd grow up into, rather than someone who's outright just crotchety for the hell of it. He's just one of those genuine characters, I think you would call him. He feels quite real, and he gets some real moments of affection, particularly when he's talking to. Real moments of emotional impact when he's talking about his experiences during the war and things like that with a veteran he comes across in a bar in a town he goes through. Really, there's not a great deal to the straight story. It's played effectively, very conventionally, and nothing like you can't level any of the same criticisms that we'd had of the previous couple of Lynch films. It's clearly his most traditionally told and shot and structured film since Elephant Man. I would argue it's not quite as good as Elephant Man. The central story, while interesting, is nothing like as intriguing as you get with The Elephant Man. That said, it's still an incredibly enjoyable film, one which I'm ashamed to admit I hadn't actually watched until a few days ago, and they're up to this, and I think I've been doing myself a great disservice. It's a really enjoyable film to watch. Nothing particularly outstandingly strange happening in it. If you're talking about it in terms of Lynch films, in the way that you kind of understand Lynch films to mean a cipher for, mental things, then this is not a Lynch film. It's a film that David Lynch happens to direct. But as with The Elephant Man, he's just showing that he can do an incredibly good job with what you'd call conventional cinema, should he choose to do it. This is, again, has all the strengths of Lynch's work. It looks really great. It's a very, very well told story. Many great performances it's got out of people. And it's just a really enjoyable film to go through, to watch. Definitely recommended. If you're looking for a film that is, Lynchian in the way that it has become an adjective, then this is not the film to go for. But I mean, it's certainly a really great film that David Lynch has done. And so definitely recommend it, although, it's not perhaps the main thrust of what you would think of when you think about a David Lynch film.
No, and again, as with Elephant Man, I feel incredibly guilty for having sort of sidelined this one because it doesn't aspire to those traditional sort of Lynchian tropes.
Yeah.
I almost felt like I was doing a disservice to the man's career by taking time out to watch those. But I mean, what a silly thing that seems now, because again, that's the mistake so many people make. And really, David Lynch, as you say, is a very versatile director and just as capable at directing what I guess you could ostensibly describe as normal movies as he is these surreal, atmosphere pieces. So yes, I shall have to prioritise straight story as well.
Yes.
And as you mentioned, taking us then on to Mulholland Drive, I guess, in which a pair of young women, one an aspiring actress, Naomi Watts, and the other an amnesiac car crash survivor, Laura Harring, embark across Los Angeles on a quest to unravel the latter's identity. Mulholland Drive starts out as one thing and becomes quite another. The arcs of various incidental characters intertwine with those of the central pair to a point. That point being the point at which, in typical Lynchian fashion, reality, or what we have so far assumed to be reality, begins to give way to the dreamscape as characters switch identities, surreal imagery begins to permeate, and mysterious hobos emerge menacingly from behind diners. Mulholland Drive plays out very much like a mystery movie, and it's so hard to so hard to describe what the appeal of this movie is. You kind of have to give over to it, and if you do, I feel like it's the apex of what Lynch has been building to all this while. It's the only Lynch movie that I've seen in the cinema, and I'm so very grateful for that, because experiencing it up on the big screen, I experienced something that I hadn't experienced before, and that was my senses, my brain in general, being effectively overridden, and having a bank of switches flicked, and I had no longer any control over my own emotion or my own ability to sort of attempt to decipher any of this, and just being swept along with it. It's I want to say it's the perfect encapsulation of what a Lynch film wants to be. Like, you can take elements from his other films up to this point and assemble them to Mulholland Drive, but it's the only film that has them all and where they play together so finely. And to describe it as a mystery is obviously doing a disservice, but like Lynch kind of wants you to treat it as such. I want to say he's engaged in more discussion on this film than he has any other. And I remember when it was first released on DVD, it came with a little hint sheet saying like David Lynch's 10 clues to unraveling the mystery of Mulholland Drive.
Can we just say how tremendously useful they weren't in deciphering anything to do with Mulholland Drive?
This is exactly it. Yeah, if you take that at face value, then you've already lost the game. Because honestly, David Lynch telling you he's got 10 clues to unravelling the mystery of Mulholland Drive is like someone handing you a tin opener and saying, open this tank with that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a strange bit of filmmaking where you can have an unreliable narrator. This is the first film where you get an unreliable director as well.
Yeah, very much so. And again, like, I mean, some of the imagery in here is just as impenetrable as actually some of the stuff if we hark back to Eraserhead.
Yeah.
But it's not, it's leading you along and taking you for a ride in a sense where Eraserhead was actually, I felt it was trying to launch an assault on you. Mulholland Drive wants you to come along for the ride. It's just kind of David Lynch isn't entirely sure where it's going either himself. It's the strangest beast to try and pigeonhole. In fact, the moment at which you start to try and pigeonhole it again, you've completely lost.
Yeah. It's an incredibly unusual film. And if you're looking at it from a purely analytical point of view, it's subject to all of the same criticisms I've been making about Lost Highway and Blue Velvet. However, that gets overridden by the fact that this one works and other ones don't.
Yeah. And you feel like you can make headway into this.
Yeah, you feel like when you're watching this that you can almost get a handle on what's going on before the ground behind you shifts a little bit and if you could
only watch it enough times, you would get to the bottom of it.
Yeah, I think what helps no end is I think always underestimated performance from Justin
Theroux, yeah,
who for essentially that first half of the film is your crutch into leading you into the film, and I think it's never really brought up often, but how important that role is, because he's going through the first quarter of this film just as baffled as you are.
He is absolutely as baffled as you. So for anyone who hasn't seen the film, Justin Theroux plays a film director called Adam Kesher, who is auditioning for a role in his new movie, and around whom all of these sort of events begin to unfold, and he is. The lead in here is that without his character, obviously, you would just be placed in this. You'd be placed in this increasingly bizarre series of events with no handle on what's happening. But he's there to hold your hand and say, "It's okay, audience. I'm here with you. I don't understand any of this either." Yeah. And that kind of gives you this little opening up until the point where obviously his character is paid the same courtesy of the others in sort of switching roles or sort of almost becoming a completely different character, if not in name then in behaviour later on in the movie, at which point you're kind of on your own, but there's no backing out by that point.
Yeah, by that point you've really been brought into the whole concept of what's going on here. You by that point you should really have, you will think you have some sort of handle on how you can process this film before it is quite skillfully pulled away from you, and you're left kind of wondering what on earth's going on. And as you say, your brain will have at that point gone and stopped trying to work on the purely analytical level, and it gets away with the dreamlike assault that will follow it. Yes, and
the final act of this movie is as baffling as anything he has done, and it's testimony to, like, the film follows a fairly, it's got the most accessible learning curve of any Lynch film in its progress from sort of, fairly, I mean, okay, the opening is shrouded in a bit of mystery. The behaviour of the main character, Laura Harring's character, is a little bit oblique.
Yeah, but you could, again, ascribable almost to logical events that have happened.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's sort of it's this gradual descent into Lynchian madness. And when I went to see this film, it was with Drew, actually, and I think it was at the Fountain Park Cinema in Edinburgh. And we walked in and thought, oh, bugger, we've missed like the first couple of minutes of the movie. And we sat down and nothing was making any sense. But hey, it's a Lynch movie. I'm not expecting it to make too much sense. And after about 15, 20 minutes, all of a sudden, the credits rolled. And actually, we'd walked in at the end of the previous performance and we thought, oh, well, that's gone and torn it now, hasn't it? And so we sat there and waited for the start of the showing that we had paid to see. And by the time we got back round to the point at which we'd walked in the first time, we were none the wiser.
No.
It made no difference that I'd seen that same piece of film just 2 hours before. It made no more sense to me whatsoever. But I was so thoroughly entranced by it that it's almost like it gives you no choice but to like it. It's the closest thing I've experienced to a film being sort of like a drug-taking experience.
Yeah, it's the one film of Lynch's that I think where he's trying to build up this otherworld narrative that he's kind of going with it, and it's the one that actually can pull you along without having to drag you. It's the one film where you actually want to follow along with it rather than have to kind of force yourself to go with it.
And I also want to say it's possibly his most cinematic movie as well, which is bizarre because it started life as a pilot for a TV show.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly looks the best of any of his films that I've seen. As you mentioned, the TV show, it does show a little bit when you think about it as that genesis. There are plot ends, there's avenues that the mystery could explore a la Twin Peaks, where it's going to be looking at certain aspects of things which are kind of hinted at and then get kind of dropped. Some of the characters' motivations or their previous lives, things like that. There's plenty of opportunities for a mystery to evolve in this, where you could quite easily see how this could have strung out into 2 or 3 series of delving into these characters and the things around them. And maybe to an extent that's a weakness of it, where you see that some of those kind of get bulldozered in its way to just fit into the 2 and a bit hours that this takes up from memory. But I don't think that really hurts it in the slightest when you actually sit down and watch it, because it all just flows so well, despite it being arguably just as nonsensical as all the rest of it.
Absolutely.
There is, again, you can interpret this to mean as little or as much as you like. It's probably the one I'd support most, the kind of building of these elaborate edifices of critical things, but that's probably just because I like this one more.
Yeah,
it
does give you more of a foothold into that, though, and whether he's done that intentionally or whether that's just a side effect, I'm not sure. But I do feel like there must be at least half of a definite sort of conclusion to be made about the movie. I still haven't come across it yet. I mean, I've watched it goodness knows how many times now, and actually one of the things I enjoy most about it, ironically enough, actually, even though I consider it to be the film that I want to say I feel most likely to get to the bottom of, if there is a bottom to get to, it's actually the one which I enjoy disengaging from the most, and just witnessing it as an experience. And every time I watch it, I find something new in it, and it hasn't failed me yet. I find something new every time I watch it, and it's so rewarding, regardless of whether it makes any sense. It's so difficult to describe. I can't articulate it.
Yeah, I think it's certainly the film, well, maybe not even just of Lynch's career, but of any film that rewards repeat viewing more than, well, yeah, it just is the most rewarding on that basis. So that it is very densely structured. You can definitely see there's been an awful lot of thought going into this one. Quite what that thought meant is an entirely different thing, and something that no one will ever, I suspect, ever get to the bottom of, because even if Lynch came out with something that he claims was what he was thinking at the time, I'm sure
you'd have no reason to trust him.
Yeah, you could quite easily dismiss that and build up your own edifice again. I often have little time for people putting too much of an interpretation of symbolism and meaning on films, but this is one in particular is one that you could build any number of ways, and I think it is strong enough at its base to support all of that, and that's probably what makes it the most interesting of David Lynch's films, and certainly, in my view, the best Lynchian film by a long way. Really, it's the only one I think that works.
It's almost a
fully.
Lego set of insanity where you can kind of build whatever you want out of the pieces.
Yeah, and we should say at the same time it's got all those hallmarks. It looks the best of any Lynch film. It has the best performances that he's got out of most of these actors. I mean, of course, Naomi Watts has gone on to a tremendous career from this, but it's a great performance from Laura Harring, who's not really done anything comparable since.
Are you suggesting that in John Q with Denzel Washington, she wasn't?
I am suggesting that. I know it's blown your mind, but yes, yes. And again, it's just 8 tremendous performances from even the smallest role on it, and I've talked, of course, already about Justin Theroux's role. But yes, it's the one Lynchian surreal scape that really works for me in a way that the others haven't. They're clearly all built towards this moment. I think this is the final distillation of all that into one thing that really works incredibly well. I don't think this was my first Lynch film. I'm sure I must have seen Dune and The Elephant Man at least at some point before this. But it was
you must have done. You must have done.
But it was probably
you were deeply into Dune before I had even started watching any Lynch, I think.
It would probably have been at points in my life where I was not really too fussed about learning the name of a director. However, it didn't quite have those interests or faculties at the time. But certainly, this is the first of the oddball Lynch, if you like, films that I've seen, and it's certainly the one that works by far the best. You can see elements and all the stuff that's gone before it that would lead to this film, but this is the one film that you really want to see. This is peak Lynch, in my estimation.
Absolutely. The ne plus ultra of Lynch. And I think the only film we've got left to discuss then is Inland Empire, which I haven't tackled yet, so I'll let you discuss that.
Yes, I had been looking forward to Inland Empire, basically on the rationale that, of course, I really liked Mulholland Drive. But Inland Empire is a real disappointment for me. It's where to start with this film. It's one of these films where, like Mulholland Drive, it's very difficult to really make a lot of headway into describing the narrative of it. I'm not sure how much of a benefit that would going to be. It, in my mind, ploughs some very similar paths to Mulholland Drive. You start off, it's return to Laura Dern to Lynch's works. She's playing an actress who lands a role in a film that was hoping to kind of kickstart her faltering career. The director is played by Jeremy Irons as Kingsley Stewart. Just into the role returns as the co-star, Billy Side at that point, I believe it is. They are informed as this film is shot that it's actually a remake of a film that had been produced previously but never released because of an unspecified catastrophe that happens on the set. A German film called 47, I think it was. And this is a remake in which they'd somehow hidden from all the producer staff on it. And at some point just after this, you start to get into situations where Laura Dern's character of the actress becomes intertwined with the character that she's playing in the film. And at that point, again, you get to the point where logic goes out the window and various realities. You get the same kind of thing that happened with Mulholland Drive. You get alternate interpretations of characters, and some of the characters taking on different roles, as you might have seen in Lost Highway, and it kind of remixes all of that stuff that's gone before it. It continues largely following Laura Dern as the primary protagonist, and it gets to a situation towards the end where everything kind of seems undone. There's some other references to Polish mythology going on throughout it that are kind of strange, as you would expect. In many ways, it feels an awful lot like a mix-up of... It's very, very clearly it's heavily influenced by Mulholland Drive, but with a few more elements of something like perhaps Lost Highway kind of thrown into the mix as well. However, it doesn't really work. Unfortunately, this kind of seems like a step too far. It's kind of it's almost like he's a retread of Mulholland Drive, but just not quite as good. It doesn't really work for most of the reasons I would say something like Lost Highway doesn't work. It doesn't do a particularly brilliant job of pulling you in. To an extent, that falls onto Laura Dern's character. She's the kind of one you're supposed to be kind of identifying with and then pulling through. But the thing, her character is not so well written or engaging, and she feels she doesn't have the same sort of sense of confusion that Justin Theroux's character had in Mulholland Drive to really give you anything to latch onto. So imagine, if you will, Mulholland Drive, where the kind of switches occur without you having anyone to identify with, and then you just sort of going, nope, at the point when things really sort of interface with the fan, and that's kind of where you are with Inland Empire. The other disappointing thing for me with Inland Empire is that it was the first film that Lynch shot entirely in digital. Now, I am not someone who thinks that automatically, a la Quentin Tarantino, that digital is a bad thing. However, when you do it quite badly, it can be a bad thing. And Inland Empire looks disgusting.
Really?
It is a really nastily shot film. The framing and all that's fine, but it just doesn't look nice. It looks like it was done on a cheap camcorder. Of course, it's knocking on a bit now. It's the most recent film we'll talk about, but it's still 2006.
Wow, that long ago.
Yeah. It's yes, but unfortunately, standard def digital video from 2006 has not aged particularly well. Certainly not in the way that the kind of more modern 4K cameras can pull off. And this looks a bit camcordery in places, and yeah, not great. So it looks kind of ugly. For points, that kind of works when at points Laura Dern's character is kind of out on the gritty streets of Los Angeles, and it kind of lends a nice air to that. But at other points, it just looks ugly. The narrative itself just cannot stand up to the usual kind of scrutiny, but also it's got the same kind of thing that happened in Blue Velvet, where there's moments that just occur that are just off the wall crazy, with no real explanation for either symbolically, thematically, or narratively that kind of really justify it, and that's a bit of a shame. It's another one where there's a number of young nubile female characters that seem to exist largely just to show you their breasts at some point. They don't really seem to serve any other purpose. It's almost like Laura Dern goes back to a frat house at some point, and as they start talking about their sex lives out of nowhere for no real reason. Yeah, it's a bit of a misfire. It's a de-evolution of everything that was so good in Mulholland Drive. It's much more shapeless. It has less of a point. Now, I know that's not the case that Mulholland Drive actually had a point, but it felt like it did. It felt like Mulholland Drive was always going somewhere, and it was always kind of driving towards one thing to me, whereas Inland Empire feels like it's going in multiple different directions at the same time and not really making a lot of progress in any of them. It was a real disappointment for me. It's, in my opinion, one of Lynch's weakest films. Nothing to do with the actors or actresses. Again, it's another clutch of really quite good performances, but there's just nothing there to back up onto it. It's very difficult to latch onto. Yeah, a real shame for me, a real downer, especially after the excellence of Mulholland Drive, which remains the best of Lynch's. Certainly of his more dreamlike stuff, yes.
So here's a question for you, right? I suppose before we sign off. For a director who's held in such high esteem, now that we've actually gone back and reviewed his, so to use the word again, but I do love the sound of it, his oeuvre, is David Lynch actually one of the great American directors?
Yes, because I think greatness does not just rely on the eventual output. It's all of the things that have led up to it, and the craft that he's shown, and the imaginativeness that he's shown, that has become so influential. I think it's been influential for other people as well. I'm sure a lot of people watch Lynch and are inspired by that to create their own works.
He's defined himself as something very singular.
Yes. He is one of the greats, because even if you don't like an awful lot of his films, there's no way to argue that they are not individual and distinctive. And for me, that is something to applaud and to be proud of. If I was David Lynch, I would be proud of that. He's done an awful lot of things that no one else has done or has even thought of or would even think of. And for that a reason alone, because he's been able to see these things, visualize them, get them shot, and have them put out there in a way that a lot of people will like. And for all of our interpretations, we've largely been in agreement, but I'm sure there are a number of people who will claim that Blue Velvet is actually the fantastic film, the actual masterpiece of Lynch's, and Mulholland Drive is dreadful, or any other combination of the things that we've talked about. Because of that, because he's so many things to so many people, that is what makes him such an interesting director and such an interesting talent to have both writing and directing. I mean, he will provoke the kind of discussions that no one is going to have about, say, Brett Ratner, who's my go-to correction of someone who's not really a bad director, but he has really no stamp that he puts on anything. He's just someone who can point the cameras in the right direction and keep things more or less on track. But David Lynch is a real auteur. He's someone who's got very distinctive goals and ideas in mind for his films and executes them quite well for the most part. And that is something to applaud, because it's not something you can get an awful lot of, and it's certainly nothing in the studio system these days that seems to be likely to occur. So
he will certainly not be pigeonholed as anything other than himself.
Exactly.
Nice. Oh, well, I'm glad we took the time to go back and review Lynch's back catalogue. I've quite enjoyed talking about it, Scott.
Yes, good. That was the plan.
Yes, excellent. And we hope you've enjoyed listening as well.
That also was the plan. I hope it has worked. And if not, well, thank you for sticking to us with an hour and a half or so of conversation about them.
Very kind of you.
Yes. Yeah, so I guess that more or less wraps it up for this episode. We will return, as we mentioned, with our Dune podcast. We'll give you that in another 10 days or so. We should be up on the 10th. Until that time, if you would like to, if you've enjoyed what you've listened to today, why not tell us? You can hit us up on Twitter. That's at FudsOnFilm. We're on Facebook, facebook.com/FudsOnFilm. If you'd like to leave a message, a review on iTunes, please do. But if you don't want to do any of that, that's fine. That's fine. We won't care too much. We'll just be very sad about it.
No, we won't send the boys round. We'll just cry deeply.
Yes. Or indeed, email us, podcast@fudsonfilm.com. But if you don't want to do any of that stuff, then just hang tight. We'll have another podcast for you quite soon. Chill out, man. But until that time, I will bid you adieu. I have been Scott Morris, and my friend over there has been Craig Eastman.
I have all day.
Farewell.
Bye.